Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware, A-W-A-R-E, are the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, May 30th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for their wars. AWARE was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7 October 2001. The group was formed by citizens of CU who saw that the U.S. said it was fighting terrorism, but was using that as an excuse to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria, but control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people, principally to control Mideast oil, for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. The American war in Afghanistan will soon enter its 16th year. Over this period, the United States and its allies have lost close to 3,000 soldiers, while an unknown number of Afghans have died. The official figure for the Afghan dead, above 150,000, is laughable. Each year, as the United Nations finds, the percentage of women and children among the official death toll increases, many of the deaths a result of aerial bombardment, including drones. Afghan sources say the number of war dead must be near the million mark. The human toll has been considerable. Last year, over 500,000 people fled their homes because of the conflict. This is the highest number of displacements since 2008. Of the estimated population of 32 million Afghans, almost 2 million have been displaced by the conflict. About 3 million are refugees from the almost 40 years of war in the country. The spring offensive of the Taliban began with a burst this year. On April 21st, a handful of Taliban fighters infiltrated the Afghan National Army's base in Balkh, a province in northern Afghanistan. They killed 140 Afghan soldiers. It was a devastating attack, which came a week after the U.S. dropped the 22,000-pound mother of all bombs, the largest non-nuclear bomb in the world, on Nangarhar, Afghanistan. The U.S. military said that 94 Islamic State fighters were killed. Journalists have not been permitted to the site, although it should be said that the district is home to 1.5 million people. The Taliban now controls over 40% of Afghanistan. Its forces could soon be in command of southern Afghanistan, which would put the Taliban in charge of the length of the country's border with Pakistan. The assassination of Taliban leaders seems to have barely dented its ability to push hard against the Afghan army and the army's NATO allies. Dan Coats, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, told the U.S. Senate that regardless of any action by the U.S., the political and security situation in Afghanistan will almost certainly deteriorate through 2018, deteriorate from the point of view of the American government. What he meant was that U.S. interests would not be met through the government of Ashraf Ghani and the security presence of the Afghan National Army. The Taliban is likely to continue to make gains. It's expected to seize a city in this spring offensive and consolidate its position through that tactical victory. The U.S. commander in Afghanistan, Army General John Nicholson, has called for an increase of several thousand U.S. troops. A leaked suggestion from the White House to send an additional 3,000 to 5,000 U.S. and other NATO troops followed swiftly. The leak came a month before Trump gave a speech to NATO on May 25th. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull told Trump that he was open to sending additional troops to Afghanistan. NATO formally ended its combat mission in Afghanistan in 2014, and there's a hesitancy among its member states, apart from the U.S., to expand its presence in Afghanistan. Germany's Angela Merkel and Britain's Theresa May are uneasy with the prospect. Both face elections this year, and both know that the American war in Afghanistan is unpopular in their countries. During the 2016 U.S. presidential election, neither Trump nor Hillary Clinton raised the matter of the American war in Afghanistan. The war has cost the U.S. at least $23 billion a year, with an initial $117 billion on reconstruction. Of that reconstruction money, 61%, $71 billion, went towards the creation of the Afghan National Army. The U.S. surge under Obama, which brought 100,000 troops into the country, failed to stem the Taliban's drive. By 2014, that strategy was silently dropped. There was little discussion about it then. The achievement of the Obama administration has been to keep the discussion of its killing throughout the Middle East off the agenda, and the Trump administration has, it seems, not been quite so successful in that regard. With the great loss of life on all sides, the waste of resources, and the futility of U.S. war aims, one would have thought that the question of Afghanistan would have been raised in the presidential debates or afterwards, but there has been virtual silence about it. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, a U.S. monitor for the money spent, has released 35 reports of considerable merit. They make for harrowing reading. They show that corruption has been endemic to the process of reconstruction. Little can be seen for the billions of dollars spent to rebuild Afghanistan. Roads remain of poor quality, and schools and medical clinics are promised but do not appear. In Balkh province, where the Taliban had attacked the army base, the staff of the American economists found that only 30% of students who had been reported enrolled in schools were seen at any one time. Teachers were absent, buildings erected with concrete dissolved in rain or had walls and roofs that collapsed. No wonder that the Taliban has been making swift gains over the past few years. Its adversary is not prepared to contain its advance. Matters are so grave that the Afghan government had to welcome warmly the old war dog Gulbuddin Hekmatyar of the Hezb-e-Islami, who was known as the Butcher of Kabul for his siege of Kabul between 1992 and 1996. Considered a serial violator of human rights, Hekmatyar is now back as a player in the Kabul political scene. On May 13th, Hekmatyar met former Afghan President Hamid Karzai to talk about the increased death of civilians. Karzai, at the end of his presidency, began to be critical of the U.S. style of warfare in Afghanistan. He argued that the night raids and the aerial attacks killed more innocent civilians than combatants. Karzai has since become bolder with his pronouncements, and in one of the most vocal has become one of the most vocal protesters against the use of the MOAB, the large bomb, on his country. He said that it was, quote, a brutal act against innocent people. A bomb of that magnitude has consequences for the environment, for our lives, for our plants, for our water, for our soil. This is poison, close quote. The meeting of Karzai and Hekmatyar suggests the formation of a new anti-American pole against the Kabul, within the Kabul political class. It's in this context that Trump's White House has suggested an increase in U.S. troops in the country. H.R. McMaster, Trump's national security advisor, hastily noted that there had been no decision yet to increase troop levels. He's afraid people might actually be talking about that in this country. McMaster, who was instrumental in the 2007 Iraq surge, is aware that in the White House a potential troop increase is already being called McMaster's war. If it fails, the blame will be on him. If it succeeds, Trump will certainly take the credit. It's unlikely that even an increase of 5,000 U.S. troops will have an impact on the Taliban's rush towards Kabul. The style of U.S. warfare is likely to increase civilian casualties, and the deterioration of the Afghan National Army will not raise the population's confidence. The Taliban, which had been delegitimized for its cruel rule 20 years ago, has now positioned itself once more as the only viable force to bring stability to the country. The reality of this is clear to many in U.S. intelligence. The return of the Taliban would be a major blow to U.S. prestige, the worst U.S. military defeat since Vietnam. Every contingency will be taken to prevent that outcome, even the destruction of Afghanistan. That's what our government is supporting. Those of us aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, call upon President Trump instead to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 700 foreign military bases. Neither Russia nor China has more than 12. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home and withdraw U.S. forces who've been sent into 3/4 of the countries of the world. 4, stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give you a better account tonight, beginning with Karen Aram.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I am going to pivot to Asia right now with an article. Again, I just read this morning, so I'm going to have to read much of it again. This is from the New Eastern Outlook. It's an online magazine, excuse me, and the author is F. William Engdahl. The title of the article is The CIA's Cloddish ISIS Attack on Duterte. So I'm turning to the Philippines right now, and this is very important in respect to the pivot to Asia. The only word I find for it is cloddish, says Mr. Engdahl, or Professor Engdahl. He said, I refer to the latest CIA instigated attempt to initiate regime change against outspoken Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. The so-called ISIS terror attack in the minerals-rich southern Philippines island of Mindanao, a predominantly Muslim part of the mostly Christian nation of 100 million people, took place literally in the midst of President Duterte's talks in Moscow with Russian President Putin on May 15th. That's when Duterte was in Beijing. He said the talks for the first New Silk Road or Belt Road Forum, as it's now referred to, or Belt Road Initiative. Carl, what is the name of it? The Belt Road
Initiative.
Initiative, okay, right. America's colonial asset since 1898 was clearly walking away from the Washington Reservation. Now, the terrorist siege in Marawi City is blatantly a desperate Washington try to topple the very popular 80% popularity in polls, Duterte, who successfully won the presidency last June over a U.S.-backed Maraxas, a U.S.-educated former Wall Street banker. Since taking office, Duterte has made bold and quite courageous steps, some of them are actually pretty obnoxious as well, to steer the former U.S. colony towards a Eurasian alliance with China and Russia as his major supporters. In Beijing in October last year, Duterte met China's Xi Jinping and signed numerous trade deals with China, critically taking an opposite policy to his pro-U.S. predecessor, Benigno Aquino III. Duterte agreed to resolve the South China Sea dispute between Philippines and China through peaceful diplomatic talks and to, as he put it, seek a separation from the United States. Since then, he has sought closer ties with Russia as well, in a further effort to bring his nation out from under the yoke of a de facto U.S. control. This does not sit well with the circles of the so-called deep state in D.C., the CIA and their nefarious friends. Should the U.S. lose the Philippines, it would pose a devastating strategic geopolitical loss to the U.S. military containment strategy against China and Russia in the Pacific. It would be devastating. The recent attacks and siege in Mindanao were nominally done by the terrorist Mate Gang and Abu Sayyaf criminal terrorist organizations, both nominally tied to the U.S.-created ISIS fake Islamist operation, a CIA terrorist project created with Saudi money going back to the CIA's Osama bin Laden al-Qaeda Mujahideen operation cyclone during the 1980s against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Now, it should come as no surprise to anyone closely following the evolving dialogues between Duterte and the leaders of China and now Russia that the CIA would try to destabilize him at this critical time. They simply hide behind the black shirts of their psychopathic drug-running Mate and Abu Sayyaf, both now tied to the CIA and Mossad-created and Saudi-financed ISIS. In Moscow, despite having to cut short his talks with Putin to fly back home and deal with the terrorist crisis in Mindanao, the Philippine leader and his secretaries of defense and foreign affairs managed to sign a number of critical agreements with Russia. These included 10 major agreements aimed at deepening bilateral defense, strategic, and economic relations. The two countries signed an agreement on defense cooperation. That's a legal framework for military-to-military exchanges, training, intelligence sharing. The Philippines and Russia also signed an intelligence exchange agreement to bolster counter-terror cooperation. That does not please Washington, D.C. at all. Now, it needs to be mentioned that Western mainstream has delighted in portraying Duterte as a country bumpkin. He is, in fact, a law school graduate from the University of the Philippines. He was a prosecuting attorney for many, many years before he became the mayor. I think he's the longest-running mayor that they've ever had. I'm going to skip some of that and go back down to ISIS bloody footprints of the CIA and Mossad in that area. No, I'm going to skip that too. I hate reading all of this. Let me just say this, because I lived in the Philippines for 2 years, and it was during 9/11, and I knew people who actually knew bin Laden's brother, who evidently lived there part of the time. Probably one of his mistresses or something was there. He was into dog racing. And yeah, dog races.
Yeah,
I kid you not, my boss was a dog racer. But so one of the things I know from that and then further research since then is that Al-Qaeda would have nothing to do with Abu Sayyaf, one of these terrorist groups in the Philippines, because they just consider them pure, criminals. And Abu Sayyaf, even at that time, was kidnapping foreigners who would go too deeply into the jungles and hold them for ransom. And when they didn't get the money that they wanted, they would behead them, okay? I think they just beheaded a missionary here within the past year, another one, okay? So that kept most of us supposedly off the streets after midnight in Manila with warnings every Friday night. Don't go out and don't have too much fun was basically what they were telling us. We don't want you to get kidnapped. Okay, this was the Asian Development Bank I worked with. To be clear, so with this Mate group, now I'm not familiar with them at all. The reason the Abu Sayyaf was just considered criminals by Al-Qaeda was because they weren't ideologues, they weren't idealists in any way. They were just criminals. So when he refers to them as criminals, I know from personal experience that, yeah, that's for sure. But now they're being groomed or they're being propagandized as ISIS. Now, I've been talking about Duterte as a vulnerable nation, head of a vulnerable nation. The fact that the Philippines, like every place else in Southeast Asia, they are very vulnerable. Not only are they very small, they're very dependent, they have been very dependent upon the U.S. military system. They don't have nuclear weapons. I think we all know what happens when people don't have when nations don't have nuclear weapons, which is awful because I'm opposed to nuclear weapons. But hey, what are you going to do? Everybody has to have their own nuke if they want to survive. What is happening? He's been playing both sides, from what I could see, coming out and saying really terrible things about the U.S., while at the same time he still allows our military bases. He closed down the ones, I think, in the south, but it's the ones in the north that are the most important. And I've been maintaining until he closes the U.S. military bases in the north, I'm not going to take anything he says too seriously. In the meantime, he has been working with the Chinese. He gets money from both. He gets money from China and projects, big projects. He gets money and weapons from the U.S., and a lot of the money that was given to him was to clean up the drug problems. And they do have very serious drug problems in the Philippines. I think it's called Yaba. And he has killed, literally. They've allowed to go out, let his force, his military force, the police go out and just kill drug dealers, drug users. They can label anybody. So it's something I'm certainly opposed to. I saw this in Thailand in the south. Thaksin, the president at that time, the populist president there, did exactly the same thing. I think the numbers of 3,000 were pretty close match. And again, now in Thailand it was in the south where the Muslim majority of people occupy. And I've always maintained that that's where the U.S. would like to bring our bases back in to Thailand. As we're in the Philippines, our bases are there. And it's clear that they don't really, they just use the South as the problem, or use this excuse that, oh, look, we've got ISIS, when we're the ones who are supporting ISIS. The other issue I see in the Philippines is that, and this is what this article brings home to me, okay, maybe Duterte, based upon the history that they've presented here, maybe he's playing both sides, but maybe I'm not thinking correctly when I think, well, when he closes down the U.S. military base in the north, then I'll take him more seriously, because closing down a U.S. military base may not be as easy as I think. Maybe that's something he can only do when he knows he has strong support from both Russia and China. And so that's what he has just finished completing, that support, military support, because the fact is there are a lot of the military people I'm sure that the U.S. has in their back pocket, okay? And any attempt, I mean, they've experienced a lot of coups in the Philippines, as elsewhere throughout Southeast Asia. So I'm going to give him a little more credibility now, even though he hasn't closed down that military base in the north. And I'm guessing that China, I'm guessing that that's one of the things they would like him to do. But I'm sure he isn't about to attempt it without their support. And now he has their support. He has both China and Russia behind him. So let's see what happens. But I'm hoping it will avert war. And we know who wants the war and who wants containment. And it would be nice if the Philippines actually had total independence from their former colonialist powers. And one other thing I do want to mention, since last week I talked a lot about the Rohingya in the north of Burma, and the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi has done nothing in respect to the fact that the military is behind the killing of many of the Muslim people in the north from what they call Rakhine, or the Arakan state. And as a result, many of her former supporters and followers have lost a lot of faith in her. What I have read since then from the Asia, what is it, the Asia News, the Asia Daily?
Asia Times.
Asia Times, that's it, thank you, Carl. Is that they actually have a lot of the gas pipelines are going through that area. And that Suu Kyi, she is, I know that she has been doing deals with China. She is working, again, both sides, one has to. But some are predicting that she, as is Duterte, is moving closer to China than, and moving further away from the U.S. because I've always maintained, people have to understand, these people, the leaders of these nations, they are very smart people, very shrewd people. They see what the U.S. is doing around the world, and they know where U.S. allegiance is apt to take them. So she's moving away. We would still like her to come out and condemn the military government of Burma, or Myanmar as it is today, when they go about killing the Muslim population of Burma. But at least she is taking some strides, excuse me, to release herself from the U.S. hold that we have on them. So.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We welcome a new columnist panelist this evening, Mark Wilson. Mark, tell me, as I ask as my actor friends say, what's your day job?
I am my name is Mark Wilson. I'm a stagehand. I'm working on joining IASTA, the local stagehand union. Cross your fingers, pretty soon.
Uh-huh.
I worked at pretty much if there's a theater in Champaign-Urbana, I've worked at it as a stagehand in some nature, within the last 5 years. Parkland College, the high schools, pretty much every high school around. I worked with Central High School, but it's a pretty tight-knit community, and we've done a lot these last few years. It's been a phenomenal experience, and it got me where I am. I have a BA in history from U of I, and I'm absolutely fascinated that you're as educated on Southeast Asia as you are, because there are just so few people educated on Southeast Asia.
That's true.
And I didn't really come with a platform, but I have 4 retorts to your statement of just statements you've already made, especially about Duterte. Oh my gosh.
Great.
And it's like you're supporting him, and I'm sitting over here aghast. Anyway, I
so
can't
tell me
wait
that-
until we get to
that-
that part. I'm here to argue,
Yeah,
and I'm so excited.
go right ahead. I didn't quite grasp your last statement, so go
Well,
ahead.
My statement.
I guess my statement would be that I'm here to proliferate and continue knowledge and awareness of the plight of the proletariat at any cost, in any measure. And war is itself just another one of the litany of ailments that economic disparity brings. And I feel every discussion of any problem with mankind needs to somehow come in context with the economic disparity that underrides it. And Duterte is a populist, and what he's doing to the drug users, I would be killed in the Philippines. I would be singled out and killed. No trial, no anything, just
Right.
by the populace. And then furthermore, it's like the only solution to this issue, to the huge drug epidemic. Prescription opioids are causing how many millions of overdoses in America a year? And right now we have an epidemic unheard of and unprecedented in American history. Well, maybe not unprecedented in or just before the what was that? The Food and Drug Act, or whatever that one was. I'm terrible with names and dates. I have a history degree, great with big ideas, terrible with names and dates. But alas, the only solution is total legalization, utter legalization.
I think you're
Absolutely.
right.
Everything across the board.
I think it's
And we
true.
have to do it everywhere, all at once. Stop empowering drug lords and cartels.
Right.
This has happened in
And
some
then-
places like Portugal.
Yes, Portugal is a
Mhm.
phenomenal example.
Exactly.
Thank you. It's like if I actually got to talk about education reform, my entire point would be Finland. I'd just be like,
Absolutely.
Finland. Anyway,
Oh,
I-
yeah, Finland.
I could
wish-
go on and
I wish
on.
I could immigrate to Finland.
you and me both, but they're exporting intelligent labor these days. They don't.
Well, their
they don't need.
education, free education, everything.
Oh,
yeah.
Pay
But,
pay teachers as much as politicians. Done.
yes. No, there's some good things to say. No, let me just respond to, I did say that I'm appalled by Duterte's
But then
drug
he
policy,
supported his.
foreign policy. I'm supporting him moving away from the U.S. because who do you think is behind his policy of killing drug users? Okay, it's quite likely the U.S. because he has been under their banner. And I have an article. It goes back a year or two. I'd have to look for it. It's from the Socialist World Socialist website, basically saying that I think it was Kerry. Who went to the it was under the Obama administration. It went there, visited with Duterte, and gave him so many, like, I don't know, $3 million or something. And he made the comment about laughing about how, gee, I have to insult them more. Every time I insult the Americans, they give me more money. But then he was using that to supposedly clean up his drug problem. But we know he's been going out and killing them. And I lived in Thailand for 22 years, and I know that Thaksin, who was also a populist, that the U.S. supported until he began to move closer to China. He did the exact same thing in the South. He went all over Thailand, and he was rounding up drug dealers, they call them. But of course, they kill a lot of people who are merely users. And let's face it, anyone who is a political dissident to their policies is going to be killed as well. So I certainly do not support these domestic policies that these people are implementing. But I look at both the Philippines and I look at Thailand, and I see what was done in Mexico when the U.S. came up with our drug war policies. And when you go back to the Vietnam War, there's a really good book called Heroin in Southeast Asia, written by, I can't remember the professor's name. Who wrote
Alfred
that.
McCoy.
Alfred McCoy, thank you. Yeah, I have it. I've read it several times. I've read it several times, actually. And the fact that the CIA was behind the bringing the drugs into the U.S., okay? So the drug wars are just an excuse. They also made a lot of money out of it, but, and Afghanistan, etc. So I agree, do away with the drug wars. And I don't support Duterte, but I leave that up to the Filipino people, just as I leave Thai politics up to the Thai people. My responsibility is American people and what we do and what our government does in our name. So what I do see is foreign policy when these smaller nations throw off the cloak of U.S. colonialism, and Thailand, who was never colonized, but yet they were, believe me, they were, as far as U.S. influence there, that's where I see some prospect of humanity's survival, because nuclear war or more wars, just the fact that Japan has been active this week in the South China Sea is really a frightening scenario, very, very dangerous. So whether I like Duterte or not, I'm pleased that he's moving closer to China.
I think the crucial points you made early on in that article, Karen, you were quoting the American official who said that the situation in the Philippines was extremely important because if the Philippines should slip out of the alliance with the United States, it would be far more difficult to contain China.
Right.
American policy is remarkably consistent over time. That is, remember, the same reason that John Kennedy invaded South Vietnam 55 years ago. Mm-hmm. The danger was that if the South Vietnamese people were able to establish a society where they made their own decisions about politics and the economy, then the long-term U.S. containment of China would be weakened. And other countries would be tempted to go in that direction, notably Japan. The whole point of American foreign policy for 2 going on 3 generations has been to contain and prevent the economic integration of Eurasia. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about. Hey? Mm-hmm. Now, what we're faced with today, and the reason that a thug like Duterte can become important, is the effective alliance of China and Russia threatening what American policy has been afraid of for more than a century. Economic integration of Eurasia would threaten the profits of the American 1%. That's what we can't have, and we got to make sure that these brush fires, such as Southeast Asia or the Philippines, are contained in order to prevent that. Now, we had to kill 4 million people in Southeast Asia to contain it. Yeah. We did contain it. The whole notion that the U.S. lost the Vietnam War is probably false. But what's happening now, not just in the Philippines, is this relative decline of what the Pentagon calls offshore control of Eurasia, that is, the control of resources into Eurasia, that would prevent that economic integration. That's the dangerous situation. That's the reason why people in Washington are trying to make friends with Duterte.
Well,
not surprising.
Yeah, one of the things I do want to point out, too, is that here in the U.S., maybe we don't just go and assassinate people for using drugs, but we do incarcerate them. If they're poor, especially if they're black, we know that we've been incarcerating people. And the local group who is No More Jails has been focused on that very well. So a lot has to do with, again, it's domestic policy, and it's up to the American people to ensure that these policies stop. And I'm pleased as a member of, because I reside here in Champaign County, that they did vote down that new jail to be built, which would have merely incarcerated more people. Let me just read this one statement here also regarding the Philippines. And I want to point out that William Engdahl is a strategic risk consultant and lecturer. He holds a degree in politics from Princeton University.
Oh, dear.
And is a best-selling author on oil and geopolitics. Why? He's supporting everything I support. That is, moving closer to China as opposed to staying under the colonial banner of of the U.S., which means likely devastation for all of humanity. Basically saying when the fake CIA sarin gas attack in Ghouta in 2013 failed to get a UN mandate for all-out war to depose Assad, Obama's infamous red line, the NATO and NATO-linked networks created the monster they now call IS in 2014. So today the CIA uses ISIS as the cover to justify keeping U.S. forces in Iraq after the government asked them to leave, a cover to bomb Syria in order to topple Assad, something Russian presence has made embarrassingly difficult since September 2015. And they use it to recruit thousands of young psycho recruits from over the Muslim work, train just says from over the Muslim work, I think there's an error here, train them and send them back to places like Chechnya in Russia, or Xinjiang in China, or Balochistan province in Pakistan, where the Chinese have built a new deep water port at Gwadar on the Arabian Sea near Iran, the heart of the $46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, a strategic part of its One Belt, One Road Eurasian infrastructure project. And he's saying that they're bringing a lot of these people, some of these people are being infiltrated into the Philippines. And he makes the point that with the deterioration over recent decades in the quality of American university education, the current generation of strategists at Langley likely missed the basic course in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, especially the part that cautions generals who wish to be victorious to know yourself and know your enemy, something that Duterte seems to have thought about. So how the ISIS destabilization trial in the Philippines unfolds in coming weeks may well determine a major turning point towards creation of the emerging China-Russia-centered Eurasian century.
I'm not sure we want to be giving advice to Langley, but that may be another issue. Mark, I think it's your serve if you want.
Oh, where to begin? Are we
yes.
are we taking that seriously or making fun of it?
Taking what seriously?
That document.
It seems to me that they're
think
like
it's
the
pretty
curate's
serious.
egg, you know, there are parts of it that are good.
There, even a broken clock can be right twice a day, I guess.
I'm sorry, say again?
Even a broken clock can be right twice a day, I guess. Less.
What do you think's right and what do you think's wrong in it?
Wrong?
Well, ooh.
You think containment of China is okay?
No. Cherry picking concepts here.
That's a major concept.
Well, I would begin by saying the containment is. I feel like at the start of it, you gave a lot of credit to America, and especially the predominant overpowering abilities of the American CIA network to be able to infiltrate and do all these crazy things. And my first response is that the CIA perpetrates. There are so many agencies that perpetrate so many evils in every government, in every form, especially our own, around the world and here, to take the concept that we can take full responsibility for many of these things, is disheartening to the people in those countries that went out of their way to make these terrible decisions. They deserve a little bit of credit as well, I think. But alas.
You've got a point there, yeah. And I've pointed out that the military governments of many of these Southeast Asian countries, they're actually quite bright, and they really do take us for a ride by taking a lot of the millions. If you read Weiner, what's his first name? Weiner, about the CIA, inside the CIA. Tim Weiner, yeah, his book, Inside the CIA, I forget the name of the actual title.
Legacy of Ashes.
Legacy of Ashes, thank you. He covers the Vietnam War very well based upon CIA released documents of that time. And it shows how the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok, they would just throw millions of dollars at the military government of Thailand in the 60s to create a veneer of democracy. And the generals, they took it, they did a lot of stuff, and then they, after pocketing all of the money, they met with the U.S. Embassy, who called them on, well, what's happening there? We haven't had any elections, what's going on? And they just pointed out to the U.S. Embassy people that, this thing, democracy, sounds like a good thing, but it really doesn't work here. Well, this is the kind of thing I saw. I've lived in Asia for almost 30 years. I saw happening time and time and time again that really the credit for utilizing how they can bend the officials. The Asians are expert at it. They are absolute experts at it. And that's why now they're going towards China, because they recognize that all they're going to get from the U.S. is war, intervention, coup d'etats. And that's what I think we're looking at in the Philippines. A coup d'etat supposedly it'll be by their military people, but we know who's behind it. It's the U.S., because we just throw millions in there in order to maintain them as our military base, as our aircraft carrier in Southeast Asia, or in the South Pacific Sea.
Mark, I'm not quite sure about the point that you're making. You're saying that we can't ascribe all the political ills in the world to the United States of America?
You want to take full credit? I mean,
no. I was struggling for irony.
Yeah,
I'm trying
We do have allies.
I'm trying to understand the point. I don't understand your objection.
Well, I'd love to continue.
Please do.
There are a lot of other powers in the region, so to focus on how the Philippines is a super important thing, it is a very important thing for geopolitical strategy. There's also the Indonesian fleet that we pretty much built, the third,
Yes.
isn't it the third largest aircraft carrier fleet in the world right now? There's the massive armament. We've allowed Japan to rearm itself. Like when was
Absolutely.
that something that we thought would be a great idea?
So would allow be the way you would place it?
Allow is a much better word, but that's still
And encourage?
encourage would be an even more ideal word. I would say. I would personally. I think that the real clinch note of the entire region's policy is going to end up being Australia and New Zealand, and how they end up actually playing in that region. We have no idea who. Right now, I mean. I feel like their mandatory voting is one of the only reasons why their people keep their politics, at least sane. But like they are caught in some crosshairs, and if there is any nation on planet Earth right now that has a real propensity to be super nationalist and as fascist as they could get, there are all of the elements that have been well brewing within Australia with the immigration over these exact same issues, and I'm surprised that. The North Korean issue is probably going to end up being the actual start of World War III. I called when I was 14. If World War III starts in Asia, it's going to be started over Australians doing something crazy. And I'm probably very wrong with that now. But I still would like to point out that Indonesia is another major player, and Myanmar is totally a failed state.
Two points on Australia.
Proxy
and
war waiting to happen.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that the Australian government would be very interested and perhaps chuffed a bit, as they might say, to hear your suggestion that they may be a major player on it. I was amused this last week when Trump was talking to NATO, and the NATO figures, the NATO leaders were dragging their feet over the American suggestion that we need to send thousands of more troops to Afghanistan, because a lot of those troops have indeed been NATO troops. The Australian Prime Minister jumped forward and said, "Oh, we'll do it. Well, we'll send troops to Afghanistan. Sure, remember us?" There's a real feeling in Australia that they have been forgotten in this American ring fence around China, and they really want to get back into the game. Remember that it wasn't 20 years ago that the U.S. overthrew a government in Australia. Because they did not think that that Australian government was supporting the America's anti-China policy strongly enough. We simply there was a coup against a prime minister, CIA organized.
And fascism's so vogue right now.
Well, and you didn't even have to mention the word fascism. You just had to say the U.S., by the way, would like the Prime Minister, the U.S. and the U.K. would like the Prime Minister of Australia to resign, to be removed, and we'd like a government more biddable to our interests put in place. This is standard American procedure. But the point that seemed to me to emerge from the account that Karen was given is how much that is a part of the general American policy, which has China as its cynosure. The reason we're concerned about the Philippines, the reason we're concerned about Australia, the reason we were concerned about South Vietnam in 1962 was China.
That's a good point.
In some ways, the most important political event in the post-World War II world, certainly from the point of view of the American ascendancy, was, quote, the loss of China, close quote. And that remains the central issue, I think, for a good bit of American policy. And when we talk about why the U.S. seems so eager to promote war and rumors of war around the world, the argument frequently comes back to China, to Eurasia, to the economic integration of Eurasia. Even Russiagate, you know, this constructed fear of Russia meddling of all sorts, is bound up with this fundamental American foreign policy principle: no competitors, no organized competitors in Asia.
I love everything you say, and please call me out every time I say something even slightly wrong. But alas, what was the point you made prior to the Russian one? The Russian one was a great point. You're absolutely right. China, the loss of, it is good business today to be a Communist Party member in China. It is good for your personal business. I mean, we talk about the loss of China. Yet
Well, unless you want to put a golf course together, something of that sort.
Good luck on that. Xi Jinping made them close down
That's
their
right.
holdings with golf courses. Yeah.
Well,
That may be the real
special
breaking
economic
point.
zones, there was a real evolution over the last 30 years of soft power, where the Chinese people have definitely chosen to take a more American path, and
Deng Xiaoping initiated the
Certainly.
move towards capitalism. Yeah.
And so I would venture to say that the real the reason war is going to happen in Southeast Asia today has very little to do with the history of China. I would venture to say, and almost entirely to do with internal politics. He needs a justification, and so he's going to create the justification for war for Trump to better substantiate his position.
Oh,
he
blame
needs
it
a
all on
war.
Trump.
He
Okay.
needs a faux pas, or I'm sorry, what's the faux pas? I can't.
No, what you're suggesting
He needs a casus
is
belli. He needs a cause for war. That's all
you're
he's waiting for.
suggesting is that the Trump administration is looking for a casus belli in Asia.
But yeah, actively. The movement of the fleet, you talk about the pivot to Asia, the movement of everything to Southeast Asia.
That
and
began
East
under
Asia.
But
Obama.
that's Clinton's policy. That's
Right.
Obama-Clinton policy.
Well,
Well,
The-
I didn't say that wasn't. Oh no, I'm not into partisan politics. I think I'm a communist, please, pacifist communist. But,
But
still.
the Obama-Clinton
doubt it.
policy
I
that
doubt
Trump
it.
attacked during the campaign is one of the reasons. One of the
ironically,
reasons.
what he's taking up now. No, I don't. disagree.
And you're absolutely right. Ironically, that's what he's taking up now. I mean, American politics
Because it's
since
the only thing that's going to substantiate his power right now.
No.
American politics
Keeps him in
since the
power.
inauguration of the new administration has been an attempt by the political establishment to reject the attacks on American policy that Trump offered in the campaign and force him back into the same policies, particularly the pro-war policies that the Clinton-Obama administration was following. If we want to talk about why the United States is making war around the world,
We should talk
we
about
have
bourgeois overlords.
we have to talk about the fact that the American public, in fact, doesn't support it. That's one of the reasons they voted for Trump, because he didn't support it. And now, in fact, they voted for Trump but got Clinton.
Yeah.
Well, that's
And here we are.
the deep state. I mean, that's what we call it.
Socialist
Something I
alternative.
want to point out is that here I have the World Socialist website, which I'm usually using, talking about behind the U.S. war drive against North Korea, which I'm not going to go into. I'll save that for another week. But North Korea is the hottest spot right now with what is taking place. However, I saw General Mattis speaking on Face the Nation, and he was claiming that, no, we don't want war with North Korea. And I was thinking, oh, well, thank God for small favors. But of course, they're putting the whole issue onto China. It's up to China to calm down North Korea. What a lot of people fail to recognize is that North Korea is China's buffer in Southeast Asia, throughout Asia. The other thing, though, that Mattis was saying that I found terribly disturbing was that he doesn't understand why Russia would be threatened by NATO on the border. And to me, that was the most outrageous statement I have ever heard a government official, especially a military official, say. And the next thing is that a lot of postings came out, I think, from Counterpunch, Carl, your friend Jeffrey Sinclair posted an interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, pointing out
The
something.
late Zbigniew Brzezinski.
The late, yes, he died. I wasn't celebrating with champagne, but at the same time, because I'm waiting for Kissinger to go. It's a shame that these people with so much blood on their hands die peacefully in their own beds at very old ages. But it was pointed out that, yes, I think we all know that Zbigniew Brzezinski was the architect of Jimmy Carter's arming the Taliban, which gave birth to Al-Qaeda and everything there today. What he said was he admitted that they actually did this before Russia entered Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they did it. We knew they did it to give Afghanistan a Vietnam of their own. I was never aware until I read that article just recently, just over the weekend, that it was done deliberately to provoke Russia into invading
Exactly.
Afghanistan. Did you know that?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Why didn't you tell me? I'm out here all the time. I've been out here for 5 years. I didn't know that. I didn't know it was a provocation to get them into Afghanistan.
I can't imagine we hadn't mentioned it.
You assumed I understood
to
it,
give
right?
to give Russia a Vietnam of their own,
knew
in
that
Brzezinski's immortal words.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a trap. That also was his word, in which the American government said that, look, we know the Russians are worried about these developments about an anti-Russian government in Afghanistan. Therefore, let's find the most fanatic fighters we can find. They happen to be Muslim jihadists. Let's give them weapons. There was no jihadism in 1978 when this took place. Let's give them weapons, send them into Afghanistan. They often were not, of course, Afghanis themselves, but
Right,
people like
right.
Osama bin Laden from other Arab countries. Let's send them into Afghanistan, said the U.S. government, to annoy the Russians. Remember, annoying the Russians has been a major part of American foreign policy, as we were discussing earlier, essentially since the Second World War, and that the prevention, once again, from the West, as it were, of the economic integration of Eurasia is forwarded from an American point of view by making sure that Russia has troubles. Russia, remember, was the victim of the Clinton administration's policy to make it a third world country after the fall of the Soviet Union. It didn't work because Vladimir Putin came along and the Russian economy and military as well revived. It's one of the reasons Putin is so desperately hated in Washington these days, and they make up this ridiculous Russiagate story in order to get at the long-term interest of American foreign policy. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 22nd week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, such as in Manchester, England, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scollery, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for articles discussed tonight. Did you have a
I thought we still had 5 more minutes. Just one conclusion. I like what Mark said about involving Indonesia and Japan and these other Asian nations. And the point is that yes, but they're losing Philippines is significant, and they may be losing due to the One Belt One Road. Thailand, I've seen that since the military coup in Thailand in 2014, and there are problems right now in Indonesia with a lot of problems going on. I'll talk about that another time. But it is important to recognize that, yes, all of these nations, but the most critical nation right now is India. India is refusing to involve itself with the One Belt, One Road. And they're going to be the losers, and that is rather frightening since they are a nuclear power. So,
Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Esterbrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, Mark Wilson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.